Hello, authors and readers, and welcome to my weekly YouTube video. This is Miranda Darrow, freelance fiction editor, and this week we're going to have another novel deep dive, where I invite a guest to chat with me about a recent novel that demonstrates a specific fiction writing skill or technique. We'll explore how the author did it, how they accomplished the skill or technique, with an aim for authors to see how it worked so they can improve their own writing skills. Spoiler alert, all of my novel deep dive videos will contain serious spoilers for the books being discussed. So if you have not yet read this month's book, The Overnight Guest by Heather Gudenkauf, I want you to read it if you don't want to have it spoiled. So pause this video, read the book, and then come back and watch this. I used to get annoyed with my book club friends who had a whole month but didn't finish the book and then didn't want us spoiling it in the one and only meeting where we were talking about that book. So if you care about spoilers, come back later. But if you've already read it, or if you don't really care about spoilers, let's dive in. By the way, if you have a book club and you'd like some help with inviting two really enthusiastic readers to your book club for this book or any of the other ones on my list, we have a book club booster kit, which is the list of questions that we're going to tackle so your group can watch along, and we'll have a timestamp every place in the video where we do the new question. So bring two bookish friends who definitely have read the book and definitely have feelings about it. So again, this month's book is The Overnight Guest by Heather Gudenkauf, and the specific writing technique we're exploring is writing a novel with a split timeline with different POVs and how that impacts the mystery plot. And today's guest is author Kelly Malacko, who writes amazing mysteries, is a co-founder of the Thrills and Chills Substack for mystery, thriller, and suspense writers, and was my 2024 RevFit winner. Thank you so much for joining us, Kelly.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yes, I will drop the links for Kelly's Substack and the Thrills and Chills in the description. So the links will be below the video. And we're going to launch right in. So the first question is, the overnight guest employs multiple timelines and multiple POVs to work through a cold case murder mystery with thriller level implications in the now timeline. How much did you know about the story structure before you started reading, and how did it impact how you went into the book?
Yes, I am part of a large book club, and we actually chose this as our Christmas book club pick. And so I knew nothing about it aside from there was a winter storm, and it's not a Christmassy book at all. But I really enjoyed it, and I didn't get a chance to meet with my group when they talked about it. So I'm excited to talk with you now.
Yeah, you'll have to circle back with some of them, especially if you have any more thoughts and insights after this.
Yeah.
So I'm notorious for reading books without reading the blurbs or the reviews, because I click on things on Libby based on, the cover and vibes, or maybe I've read something and I don't remember it by the time it comes in as an audiobook from the library. So I had no idea. And so when I first started reading it, I'm like, wait, what's going on? What's the timeline? And so I had to stop and go back and figure it out. It wasn't quite as shocking as when I read Kill Your Darlings, which was going in reverse chronological order, and that took me 3 chapters to figure that out. But when I finished, I went back and I reread the first few 2020 timeline chapters. Uh, no, it was which timeline? With the old timeline, the year 2000 timeline chapters. And then I added this to the list of books that I wanted to do for Novel Deep Dive because the story structure was so interesting. So there's three main timelines. The first is August of 2000, when the Doyle family massacre happens. And so just for sake of simplification, because I just call that Y2K. If anybody's remembers Y2K, that was about the year 2000, and this timeline was taking place in the year 2000. Then there is the current day timeline with the true crime writer who has moved to the area to do research about the Doyle family killings, with events happening the night of a snowstorm. And so that's the current timeline. And then we have an unclear timeline with a young child growing up with her mom as a captive of her father. And I call these the Room timeline because it does have a very similar feel to the book Room by Emma Donoghue, in which the POV was a young child being raised in an underground bunker. All of these timelines did a fair amount of world withholding and keeping facts secret from the readers. Which one of those three do you think had the most straightforward storytelling?
I'm glad that you thought of it as the Room timeline too, because I definitely made that connection right away when I was reading it. They're very similar. But I thought that the year 2000 timeline was the most straightforward for me. But I think also a part of it was that some of it was a little bit hard to read, and I sort of distanced myself from it a little bit. So I kind of read it more as like factual. I was trying not to like read into the emotions so much, so I held myself back from it a bit. And I think the room timeline was told through a child's POV, most of it. So it was sort of filtered through their thoughts and experiences. And the current day timeline was filtered through the POV of someone trying to distance themselves from the old crime. So they were a little bit more biased to me. So even though I was kind of trying to distance myself a little bit more, I definitely felt like the Y2K timeline was the most straightforward. How about you?
Yeah, I agreed. I thought the Y2K, even though it jumped around in POV a lot more than the other ones, I thought that Room was inherently unreliable because of the POV character's age, and she didn't really understand that her dad was actually their captor, which is reasonable given her age. And then there was the current timeline where Wily, our main POV character there, was clearly withholding. And maybe it was just the name, because I grew up watching Looney Tunes and Wile E. Coyote, and you can't trust him. Wily means that they're clever and crafty and not necessarily trustworthy. But maybe Wily was a very valued customer at Acme Products. We don't know. But yeah, I thought the Y2K timeline seemed a lot more factual, like it was a bunch of reports coming from different directions, and they were telling a pretty consistent story.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now we're going to tackle the three timelines separately and explore their use of POV. First up is the Y2K, where we're shifting between a host of characters. We have police, we have neighbors who are also potential witnesses, we have the parents of the missing girl, Becky, but we're most often following 12-year-old Josie Doyle. And the timeline has some jumping between these characters, more than I could count, because at first I was making a list and I'm like, forget it, that's too many. Some of the POV characters we only see once and we never see them again. And some are related to other people in the story, but it's not really clear why when you first meet them and you have to like track people's last names. Do you think that the readers needed this many POVs, or could the story just have been told through Josie's POV or Josie and one other person in Y2K? And then how would that have changed the story?
Yes, I agree. It was interesting because there were so many different POVs in that one timeline in particular. And it actually, the book opens up with a timeline of a woman she's mentioned briefly one other time in the book, and that's it. And it just basically sort of
Was that
lent
the Abby
home.
Morris? Where did she show up again?
She was handing out pictures when they were searching, like when the
Because I
community
was
came
like,
together.
where does she show
I
up
know.
again? She's our
I
first
just
person. And
found it on the second read. I was like, I don't know who this person was. And she kind of heard, I'm guessing it was Josie calling for her dog. And so, yeah, you felt how close she was to the farm. But I think they just had basically it was just sort of to lend that foreboding tone to the story and sort of show the how it affected the community. There was so many little things that if she had talked to the man in the truck, then you might have a witness for later. Or, if she had, I don't know, if the police had taken her a little more seriously or looked a little deeper into that, maybe they would have found that white truck connected to the eventual kidnapper. But yeah, I kind of like the community feel of it. But I'm always one who likes the multi POV books. I love when there's a big cast and you sort of have to do a little legwork to figure out what the connection is or what they're bringing to the story. Yes, what were your thoughts on the two
yeah, so
POVs?
for the Y2K timeline, I thought the progression as it was scattered out throughout with the other timelines interspersed in, that they were answering questions, and some of which were still lingering for readers when they were reading the current timeline, but most of which Wiley already knew. Okay, and so this would have been tricky to work in the details of the police investigation if we were just with Josie or her parents' reaction. If we wouldn't have had like Becky's parents' reaction and stuff if we only had Josie's perspective. It could have worked because we could have had information from the cops coming and interviewing her or interviewing her grandpa, and she's overhearing it and stuff like that. But I did like the multiple because it's a small community and everybody in town knows about this family and knows about this girl and the one that's missing, and her mom works at the grocery store. I really like the perspective of Levi, the young deputy who pulled over Brock Cutter, who was driving his truck away from the Doyle farm the night of the killings, and let him go and then felt guilty about it. But I do think there might have been some unnecessarily complicated paths to some of the clues in the Y2K timeline. For example, in Josie's POV, we find out that her brother Ethan is hanging out with a boy who was around his age. So Ethan was 16, this boy Cutter is also 16, and we find out that Cutter is his last name on page 37. And in Josie's narrative text, it says Cutter has a first name, but no one calls him by that. So this kind of implies that Josie doesn't know what his first name is, but she knows that Cutter is his last name. But because this is a small town and her dad has had a feud with Cutter's dad over some property, she knows that this boy's name is Brock. The parents are not calling him Cutter at the table. They're calling him that Brock, or the Cutter boy or whatever. And that his dad is Randy and his mom is Deb. She knows all this. She's 12. She's not a young child like from the room POV. And that his mom Deb actually had a POV in the first chapter, which I didn't realize until I read through the second time. Um, and she had realized that both Randy, her husband, and Brock, her son's trucks were gone. And then we find out that Brock has a cousin who's a buddy of Deputy Levi's. And so there's lots of characters in there who all have the last name Cutter. There's four of them. Because there's Brock, there's Randy, there's Deb, and then there's the cousin whose name I forgot. We know that she knows it, though, on page 145 when Deputy Levi is interviewing Josie, and she mentions that Ethan was hanging out with Cutter after supper, and Levi asks Cutter, and Josie answers Brock Cutter. He's my brother's friend. And it's just like, well, it was Brock Cutter. So when you had that internal monologue on page 37, Cutter's his last name, but nobody calls him by it. You could have just said then, and his first name's Brock, but nobody calls him that. It was just like unnecessarily withholding because I'm trying to draw a family trio over here, and she knew it all along. Josie didn't meet up with him and ask him his first name between the hours between the shooting and this interview. She knew it all along, but the POV character was keeping it coy by calling him Cutter and saying nobody uses first name, even though there's four people with that last name. And so I thought that was an unnecessary bit of tricky business there. And there's a bit more deception on page 57 when we see that Josie and Becky are together and they're wandering around and looking for Roscoe, who's the Doyle's lost dog. And Josie and Becky see a truck creeping towards them, a white truck, this very important, creepy white truck. And Josie looks in the truck and she sees a man in a dark jacket and a hat that's pulled low, so it's shielding his forehead and eyes. And she remarks, it's too hot to be dressed that way. Accurate, it's August. And then she has a ripple of fear. We know this is the guy, this is the killer, this is the kidnapper, because we know something's happening. And then Becky asks, is it that creepy Cutter? Which one? Which one? I don't think it was Deb they were talking about, but is the creepy, that one I'm just like, okay, that's intentionally vague. But is it creepy Brock, the 16-year-old son who's flirting with these 12-year-old girls, or is it the creepy dad? And Josie answers, I don't think so, but I couldn't tell. And so presumably Becky meant Brock, maybe because he'd been around earlier, or they could have said Cutter's dad. But this was very coy. They were hiding a lot. And so the whole mood in when we're reading through the Y2K section kind of reminds me of the series that I watched recently, Something Bad is Going to Happen. So that title, it's just like, oh, bad things are going to happen. We know it. We know it because we start and they talk about the shooting in the cornfield in the very first chapter. And so we know something bad's going to happen. And then they go back in time to the day before and all this creepy stuff is happening. And we know it's building, but they were hiding a lot, even in the most straightforward of the POVs. There, that's my thoughts. Okay, next question. In Y2K POV, it occasionally zoomed in with a close POV, especially with Josie the night of the shooting and the next morning when she discovered her parents' dead bodies in the house. But often the POV was more pulled back, more remote, and it was an omniscient POV. that they didn't really have in the two other timelines. And this included an omniscient narrator, voice from the future, both with Josie and with some other characters. Did this mix of close and remote POVs serve the story? And do you think that the voice from the future enhanced or distracted from your enjoyment as a reader?
Well, when I read this Y2K POV, I got to a point closer to the end where I thought this was this was actually the true crime book that Wiley was writing. And so that sort of made everything make sense. Like she was writing when Wiley was writing events that happened to her, they were close because it was from her own memories. And then when she was reporting on things that she had researched or from interviews she had, it kind of pulled out at those points. So I thought it worked for me. And it might have been an easier way for the author to get those facts in the order that they wanted. But I was willing to go along with it once I found out that this was, or I thought it was sort of the story that she was writing, the true crime book. So it worked for me. What were your thoughts on the 2000 POV?
Yes. And so it was more detached and remote, but it was clearly following one character through a lot of it. Um, and so, like, yeah, I mentioned in my notes, I also had Abby Morris was out for her walk with her dog Pepper. And I'm like, oh, great. I also have a dog named Pepper. And then we never see Pepper again. And I'm like, well, that was a tease. And then we get, like, in the same chapter, we also see Sheriff Butler commenting on the lack of crime. Well, that's what you think. And then we see Deb Cutter remarking on how Randy, her husband, and her son Brock are both gone along with their trucks. And what's that popping noise off into the distance over by the Doyle farm? And then in the end of chapter 1, we end with Josie out in the field, and Josie and Becky are running from a gunman, and she lets go of Becky's hand when she stumbles, and she keeps running as the man fires at them. And we're with them, but we're bouncing around, and it's a bit detached. And so when we're following Josie, it's not always close. Because one example that I thought, wow, this is weird, is on page 41, we're watching Josie, and her dad, William, is fighting with her brother Ethan for taking Josie and Becky out shooting with the terrible rock cutter boy. In that scene, her dad is referred to as William. And I'm like, what kid calls their dad William? My father's actual name is William. I do not call him William. I call him Dad. And it's like even in third person, Josie's dad or Dad, it'd be closer than that. And so it did. But when you mentioned it's actually the book that Wiley is writing, that would make sense. But then we have the parts where she's in the cornfield and she's running, and we are in very close POV. And I'm like, do we think that's part of the book too?
I honestly think that the whole 2000 timeline is her true crime story. Like
I
her,
love that theory. I love that theory. Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Oh
What?
no, we're here for the wild theories.
Yeah,
Yes, the author can send us a note and say,
yeah.
that's right, you got it, or no, but maybe I like that too. Who knows? And so
Yes, please do. Please clarify. I would love that.
yes, please reach out, Heather Gudenkauf. Yeah, I thought like in chapter 4, which was the second Y2K POV chapter, it starts out with omniscient. They're talking about the whole town of Burden, Iowa, population 844, with 7,000 people in the whole of Blake County, Iowa. It's August 11th, it's near the end of summer, and then we zoom in on Josie, 12 years old, getting ready for Becky to come over and spend the night because they're going to go to the state fair. And Roscoe the dog is missing, and Josie is the person most concerned about Roscoe. So she starts looking for Roscoe, and she sees a creepy truck, and she throws a rock at it. And I'm like, who's throwing rocks at trucks in the country? Your dad would smack you down for that. But there's all sorts of foreshadowing, and the Stockery truck is there. And so we get all this buildup, and I get it. I live in central Minnesota now, and my husband drives a gray F-150. And it's impossible to find it in the parking lot at the high school because half of them there are gray F-150s. So you have to look for the mirrors because but half of them have big mirrors for their trailers anyway. So good luck. Good luck finding that white truck in Blake County, Iowa in the year 2000. And then we see this future POV where Josie and Becky jump into William's truck and we see them driving away from Ethan. They're leaving Ethan there to walk back. and they have taken the dad, William, has taken Ethan's truck keys, but he didn't manage to disarm him. He didn't manage to take away the shotgun that he got from Grandpa, and it's not yours, you can't take it. So then we see Ethan as they drive away, and then some future narrator jumps in on page 42 of the paperback and says, less than 8 hours later, William and Lynn Doyle were dead, and Ethan and Becky were missing. And I'm like, we were going to get there. Did we need that? I don't know. And so, and then there was another time after the girls wander the countryside and they're looking for lost dog Roscoe, and they go to the home of Jackson Henley, whose mom has cancer, and he's a weirdo, and he came back weird from the war, but he was weird before. And then they see this white truck again. And then they go back and they head to Josie's room, and the feature POV jumps in again and says, looking back, Josie wishes that she would have given her mom a long embrace. And I'm like, okay, maybe this is the book, but I was like, it took me out of it. But I'm personally not a huge fan of voiceover from the future person in narrator inserting themselves. I think the story would have worked just fine without knowing that looking back, Josie wished she would have. Yes, of course she does. We don't need somebody to tell us that. And we don't need her adult thoughts, I think, in the Y2K timeline. So that was my thought. Because your thoughts on the future seeing POV?
Yeah, I guess I didn't, it didn't pull me out so much to have that sort of omniscient voice, but it is an interesting technique to just drop in occasionally, and I can see a lot of people getting hung up on it. Yeah.
Me. I'm
Oh,
like,
that.
if you're gonna have a voicey omniscient narrator, they need to be in like every chapter or every chapter from that timeline. Like Lemony Snicket. Have you read the Lemony Snicket books? And it's just
No, I
like,
haven't.
oh, gentle readers, don't read ahead, you'll be afraid. And it's just like, and they're middle grade books, and then they tell the story about the Baudelaire orphans and Count Olaf and stuff. But every time they start one of those books, we get a wind up from Lemony Snicket, the narrator who's telling us the story, and they're telling us about telling us the story, and that we should buckle up, and that this is all terrible. And yeah, and I'm just like, we just have a little of that, and they just come boom, boom, dropping out of nowhere. Anyway, it's a feature, not a defect, but it's not one that I necessarily think is necessary for the story. All right, we're going to jump ahead to the now timeline. So the now timeline sticks with crime writer Wily's POV, but she's keeping secrets too. She's acting like she moved to this remote area in Iowa just to write her next true crime novel, but she's not being honest about her true relationship to the area, the people, and this crime. And so, does it seem true to Wily as a character, or do you think that this makes Wily an unreliable narrator?
This actually really interests me, this whole part of like playing fair with the reader, because there's such a fine line, I think, and some people have really strict rules, and you can like, if you cross that line with them, you're done. They'll never read you again. But I think I'm kind of a little bit more willing to go with the author if I'm enjoying the book. So I felt this one, I felt like Wiley was, you could explain uh, why she was distancing herself. She was the sole survivor of this horrible tragedy, and she'd moved away, changed her name, was trying to distance herself from the person that she was before. So I almost read it as if like she's almost a different person. She was 12 when this happened, and she's old enough to have a teenager herself now. So she's probably lived more life as Wiley. So I could kind of go with it that she was, she distanced herself so much that she wasn't, she wasn't that same girl. But there were things like on the second read, there were hints that she was uncomfortable in town. She wanted to go to the bigger grocery store in the next town over, but she couldn't. And she tried to dodge interactions with locals. The stretch for me was with her old house, because I think even if you had distanced yourself, if you were back in the house that you were raised in and where something so traumatic had happened, you would have memories, you'd have flashbacks, and
Yes.
good and bad, of her time in that house. And even like she talked about making a phone call to see if the remote farmhouse where the 20-year-old crime took place was available. So like, is it still in her family, or who did she
Right. Who
call
owns
for that?
this?
And
Yeah.
yeah. And then it also said later on, only the family members refused to talk to her, but that's her grandparents who raised her. So they,
Right.
yeah, they would probably still talk to her, but maybe they didn't want to talk for her
Or
book.
are they still alive? I mean, they are grandparents and she's an adult, so they would be great grandparents of a teenager. That's,
Yeah.
yeah. And so they didn't talk to her because they're all dead
Yeah.
now, is kind of how I read that. And I'm
Yeah.
like,
There might
you're
be
going to have a
reasons.
seance, you're in the house.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I went with it, but there were stretches. Yeah. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, this timeline kind of bugged me the most because Wiley's a writer. She's like us, we're writers. She's supposed to tell the truth. And here she is lying about who she is. So, here, spoiler, we already had two spoiler alerts. Wiley is Josie. Wiley is grown up Josie. And so she's lying about her connection to the case, acting like it's just research for a book, not like she's returning to her hometown and to her house where her whole family was brutally murdered. She's acting like she's never heard of these neighbors before when she spent the first 12 years of her life surrounded by them. So she's a little pathological. So I think she's definitely unreliable. At one point in the current timeline, she sees Randy Cutter, Brock's dad, who was the killer who abducted Becky all these years ago and has kept Becky locked up and is the bio father to the little girl in the room timeline. Josie would have known that her dad had had a property dispute with Brock's dad, rightfully, and and that and that was a reason that her dad didn't want Ethan, her brother, hanging out with Brock. Josie would have also known that Brock ended up dead in a car crash shortly after her family's murder. Because you can't avoid news like that in a town of 844 people. No, she would have known this guy, Brock, that I hung out with before my whole family got murdered. He's dead now, too. And so when she sees Randy Cutter and she doesn't think and remember all of that, you're just you're just lying to yourself. And it's just like you do that. She doesn't have amnesia. She remembers this. So on page 135, Wiley says, from her research for the book, Wiley knew that Randy and Deb Cutter had divorced and he had moved to another residence not far away. I call BS. She knew this from her grandparents, right? Who still had connections with those people because they had moved away, but they probably still got the local paper, and to keep up with what was going on. A divorce would have been all over that town. Be real. Couching it as research for her book, like she has zero history with these people. It makes Wiley the least reliable of the narrators. And then the part was like, you're supposed to be an investigative reporter. People who do true crime are trying to find new angles. They're not just supposed to report everything that they already have in their mind. She keeps insisting that Jackson Henley must have been the murderer, despite very little proof and zero motive, because the cops had said so. And so even when Becky comes in from the storm and says, that's it, Randy was the person who kidnapped me, she's like, no, you're wrong. How is Becky wrong? No, think, be more inquisitive, be more, question the narrative. That's what crime writers are supposed to do. Yeah, because they're supposed to be learning, digging. She was the least curious writer I've encountered as a character.
I can see that.
All right, next up, we're going to get to the room timeline that has a POV character who is unnamed until the very end, young daughter of the abducted woman. So we figure out, well, most of us that read a lot of mystery and crime, are just like, hey, this woman who's locked up here, that's Becky. Becky disappeared. We never found Becky. There she is. And she's raising this child. And this mother and daughter are living in there, and it's very similar to Room. And then they sneak out and they get upstairs and they get some food. And then they're like, oh, hey, look, there's some keys. There's an old truck. Maybe we could try and make a break for it. And then they don't tell you that this timeline is shortly before now, but I kind of suspected it, and that the boy that Wiley found was actually this girl with a haircut. Uh, did this realization make you rethink any of the previous assumptions about the central mystery and who killed the Doyle family?
Yeah, I didn't. I'm kind of like you. I think I made the connection pretty quick between the children. Like I just didn't see a way that there could be another. little boy somewhere. It seemed too unlikely to have the child be anyone else, but somehow connected. And it kind of confirmed that the kidnapping had morphed into forcible confinement and turned into something even more traumatic. And I think, I don't know, I was thinking like maybe the Becky, the mother of the little boy, was trying to protect a little girl from their kidnapper. Maybe she always kept her hair short to make her look like a boy, or but then it made sense when the mother said, we're going to run away and you're going to tell no one who you are or who I am or where we're coming from. It made sense that the child was keeping that secret. And I don't know, I guess at that young of age, kids are kind of gender neutral when they have short hair and they're maybe a little malnourished too and frozen to the snow. They probably don't
Yes.
look like. So yeah, I could kind of see that mistake. But what about you? What did you think of the little boy at the beginning? Did
Yeah,
you
I thought there was one main purpose for having the whole room timeline, and that was to clarify that the person who killed the Doyle family didn't die that same night or
Mhm.
shortly thereafter. So then this killer, they abducted Becky and they fathered this child and was a complete creep. This means that any suspects who show up dead or otherwise out of the picture in the Y2K timeline, they are eliminated as suspects because they are not the person who is holding Becky and young Josie, because we find out at the very end that Becky had named her daughter Josie after her best friend. So when we find Ethan dead in the barn, well, I guess he didn't do it. When Brock dies after fleeing from Deputy Levi, well, it's not him. And then when Jackson was sent to prison, well, it wasn't him. So now we've run out of suspects. And so, but I did like that it's just like, oh, well, the people that you thought it was couldn't be because there's an ongoing crime that's been going on for more than a decade. So,
Mhm.
all right.
Yes.
So one of the big mysteries from the room section is when is this taking place? Who is the father? And what is this girl's name? Did you think that these story questions were presented organically, or did you think that some of them were a bit forced?
I thought they were organic. I have a lot of thoughts about Becky choosing Josie as a name for her daughter. But first, I guess all of the characters in the room timeline being unnamed to me sort of represented them being outside of society, like, and also from a child's point of view, there are mother and father, and you don't really think of other names. And it's the same thing for the timeline. I don't know that they have real world confines in their captivity, like does time even pass on the same 24-hour clock for them when they're just locked in a basement? So those ones I felt like they were organic. Uh, Withholding the name, I think they explained it by saying that the Becky told her daughter to pretend to be a boy and warned her not to talk to anybody. And I think for me, withholding it until the end kind of provided a little catharsis once the whole story came out. Like Becky didn't blame Josie.
Yes.
And it sort of highlighted that like Becky had thought before it was the most beautiful name in the world. And in the earlier Y2K timeline, she had wanted to change names with Josie. But what I would have liked to see, and they sort of touched on it a little bit at the very end in the climax, but what did Cutter think of, like, who suggested that? Was it Becky suggested that or Cutter? And yeah, I would have almost liked to have read that scene just to see his reaction to that because that interests me.
Yeah. Who picked the name Josie for the little girl?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I've got some thoughts on that too.
Oh,
So
perfect.
yeah. No, and so first I'll do the first question, which was these story questions from him. I'm gonna give a child like that more grace and not say that they're unreliable because they just don't know stuff and they don't have a whole lot of context. that the readers are figuring out what the child doesn't know, that the child doesn't know her mom was abducted and that this isn't normal and that they're in constant danger and dependent on this awful man. It makes sense that she doesn't know her father's name, but it did seem a little contrived that in the room timeline, before they actually left, that the mom never called her by name. I don't know. I mean, people don't always use each other's names when they're talking to each other, but we have a number of scenes where they're together and the mom never calls her by her name. And it's just like, well, that's a little odd. But I gave him a lot of grace for that. But I do think that later we find out when Randy Cutter is in the now timeline
Mhm.
at their house trying to knock off all these witnesses and to knock off Wiley and drag his woman and his child back to the secret bunker, that he had said to Wiley, who was Josie, I wanted you. He took
Yeah.
Becky as a consolation prize. And so, yuck. What
Yeah.
plans did he have for his own daughter Josie for in giving her that name?
Yeah. That was actually, it was like, I don't know, one or two lines. It was very small, but it was so horrifying because he even said, like, I didn't plan on killing your whole family. I just wanted to kidnap you. But
Yeah.
because you weren't there, I killed your whole family. It's like, oh,
And then I
oh,
took your friend who was with
yeah.
you because I had already constructed this underground bunker. And we got the end to that in the very first chapter in Deb Cutter's POV when she
Yeah.
was talking, he's spending all this time at this outbuilding. And it's just like, yes, he's building his bunker because he's planning to kidnap Josie.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
That Deb Cutter POV, that one bothered me a little bit. She heard the gunshots. She knew neither her husband nor their son were home, but she never linked those two things. And she knew that he was, yeah, working on this other yard. I don't know. That's questionable, but
Yeah, she wasn't very
obviously she's a liar.
curious. Which of the three timeline adds the most impact to the story? And do you think all three of them were needed and helpful in telling this compelling mystery thriller with a split timeline?
Yes. I went back and forth on my answer for this, but I think the year 2000 timeline had the most impact on the story for me. I felt like the room timeline sort of highlighted the tragedy and that it was ongoing. It was a crime that was lasted years, which was made it worse. And then I think having the present day timeline, like I said before, I think that kind of brought a little bit of catharsis and resolution. And it recast Josie as the hero because she was, she let go of her friend's hand and she kind of saved herself, which she's 12, someone's shooting at her, obviously. No one knows how they're going to react, and a 12-year-old shouldn't be expected to be a hero. But it was it was nice as a reader to have that sort of it was sort of like a little bit of a happy ending, I guess, at the end of a bit of a dark book. Like it's nice to see her as the hero. Yeah, I would still say the room or the year 2000 timeline, it was the most visceral for me, and that had the most impact on the story for me. What about
Yeah,
you? What did you think?
I agree. I think that we found out the most in the Y2K timeline. The
Mhm.
story starts there, and unlike most timelines, a lot of split timeline stories, they start in the present and then people start digging into the past. But this one starts in the past with the cold case. And the story is really grounded in Y2K with just some hints of future consequences. And then the future consequences start to have some teeth when we realize that the killer was never caught, that someone else took the blame, that the killer is now showing up at Wiley's cabin in the middle of this blizzard, looking to retrieve his runaway captives, Becky and their child. Uh, I'm not exactly sure that we needed the room POV, but I liked it. I liked that it added some context and clues of just how horrible this crime was and that it wasn't all over and done in the August of year 2000, that it was still going on decades later, and it makes it more horrific and the stakes are much higher then.
Mhm.
All right, we focus mostly on the split timeline and the different POVs, but let's take a few minutes to talk about the role of being a mother and how it shows up in the story. Did you notice the contrast in parenting styles and how that relates to what these characters had gone through in their past.
Yes. Yeah. I thought there was a clear juxtaposition between Wiley and Becky as mothers. And I found the early mentions of Wiley's relationship with her son kind of hard to relate to in the beginning because I'm a mother and I have teenagers, and her son was 14 and argumentative. And so she kind of sent him off to live with his father and refused to parent him. And it had been months, it seemed like, since they had really talked too much. And that I was having a hard time following that thread. Like, I just don't see a mother, it just didn't seem quite right. Teenagers are hard, motherhood is hard. But
Yes.
then when you realize what happened with her sullen teenaged older brother and the relationship that like that dynamic with between him and her parents, and that there was always kind of questions right away in the beginning about him. Maybe that's it was like a trauma reaction for her, sort of. And then with Becky in this horrible confinement situation, and she's so sweet and gentle with her daughter who has, half the genetics of this man who's kidnapped her. It would be so hard to be a good person in that situation, or a good mother, or yeah. So that was interesting. And I wondered too if, because that point of view was told through the child's eyes, maybe that's a child's version of what their mother is. They kind of see like, oh, they're so sweet to me and they gave me the extra food. And then Wiley's POV is from her own. It's kind of her judging herself as a mother and being very critical. So I wasn't sure if that is an appropriate angle to see them from, but yeah, that's kind of how I thought of it. But it almost made Becky seem like she was the better person, and maybe out of the two girls that were running away, the better person went through this horrible situation. I don't know. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree that Becky, who had been Randy's prisoner since she was 13, who spent the last more than a decade locked in his basement while she delivers premature babies who die and then finally gets a baby girl, Josie, who lives. She is a caring and protective mother to her daughter, Josie. Meanwhile, Wiley was traumatized by the loss of her entire family in this horrific crime. Uh, she is she's the parent of a teen boy, and she pretty much washes her hands of him because he's an annoying teen. And I'm a parent of teens. I understand the impulse, but she really wasn't calling or trying to be involved or even really thinking in her narrative text about her son very often because she's kind of all wrapped up in herself. And she's pretty cold to the little boy who shows up too. She's like, oh, hey, do you want something to warm up? You can have it or not. I don't care. I have no sense of urgency to get any help for you. And it's just like, be on my couch. It's warmer here. Becky, despite her poor timing in trying to escape into a storm and driving when she never learned how to drive because she was 13 when she was abducted, she had some poor timing with the escape, but she was clearly trying to get a better life for herself and for her child. Yeah, and so I think maybe it was out of necessity, but Josie was living for that child, whereas Wiley was not living for her child.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting. And even I think the there was a little bit of play between the mothers in like Becky's mom, who was going through a divorce or recently divorced, and Josie's mom, who was sort of raising her kids on a farm and like maybe looked a little bit more, I don't want to say wholesome, but I thought they kind of played with that dynamic a little bit. But then, yeah, there was so many problems with Ethan, and yeah, I thought there was a bit of a theme of motherhood throughout this and how they
Yes,
reacted to.
motherhood and friendship, because
Yeah.
I thought it was super interesting in the Y2K timeline when Josie is feeling how Becky had kind of distanced herself from her a little bit lately. And so it's like They used to be the best of friends. Becky had said she wanted to trade names with her. They'd cut their fingers and become blood sisters and had matching scars. But then you're kind of wondering, along with Josie, who's also wondering, is Becky here to be with me and to go to the fair with me, or is she here to be close to my brother
Yeah.
or his friends because they're a couple of years older? I grew up in a rural area. I have brothers. I wondered sometimes with people coming over to my house because they wanted to, you know, it was just like, and I'm from a small town. And so several of my classmates did date my brother who was 2 years older and was in high school at the same time. And it's just
Yeah.
like, yeah, I know that feeling, Josie. I too am just like, hey, wait, why don't we stay here and hang out on the trampoline? I was like, no, let's go shooting with the boys.
Yeah.
Mm, mm.
No,
So,
trampoline.
but, but she forgave her and she still wanted to be friends with her
Yeah.
decades later. Yeah. So, but I could see why Josie would have all that guilt and feel that Wily, grown Wily, that she can't really, be close to people because they've all gone, they've all left her, especially if she's also since lost her grandparents, which I was kind of assuming she was because she didn't talk about it at all. And so, but she's a little cold. So maybe I was offing Grandma and Grandpa Matthew and whatever her name was prematurely. Okay. One of the benefits of having the room timeline showing that Becky has been held captive by the criminal and drawing out the past timeline allowed the readers to maintain a list of suspects who slowly get eliminated. Oh, I kind of jumped ahead and answered this one a little bit. As the year 2K timeline, Y2K timeline progresses, the suspects get ruled out as they die. Did this seem natural? Knowing that there's a future omniscient narrator looking around who knew this all along.
Yeah. This one, I I did think it was a good way to rule out suspects, and I thought it was clever to have Ethan like have them find him a little bit later. So there was people were kind of you started to internalize a little bit like could this boy have actually done all of this horrible things? But so so yes, I liked that it was you sort of went through your list of suspects and they got ruled out. And because I read this timeline as Wiley's true crime novel, it seemed to fit the needs of the fictional story and also the true crime story plot. Like if you're writing a true crime novel, you want to lure your reader through as well. So that kind of worked for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Question, answer. Suspect? Nope. Next
Yeah.
suspect? Nope.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Did that work for you?
yeah, I liked it. I thought that the immediate suspicion going on Ethan because he had fought with William the dad, but then we find out he was killed the same night, but he's not found until much later. When Josie and her grandpa were in the barn caring for the goats and they smelled his dead body, I'm just like, oh, he had been a top suspect for the police, for Becky's parents who were like, let me at him. And we're like, really? You think this was Ethan?
Yeah.
And Josie herself, who was wondering, could Ethan have done this? And then the suspicion turned to Brock Cutter, who was high up on the suspect list. He'd been there that day. Deputy Levi had seen him driving away and chased him, and then later chased him down until Brock and Levi both crashed, which killed Brock and ended Levi's career in law enforcement, which I read as a spinal cord injury. And that leaves very few suspects left. Creepy neighbor Jackson Henley, the neighbor who had the property dispute, which was Randy Cutter, and then a missed opportunity, Kara Turner's dad, who had called William Doyle and asking that Ethan leave his daughter alone. And so, and so I thought that was a possibility that didn't get run down enough because we did hear several times about Kara Turner and Kara Turner's dad. And so I'm like, well, they could have had a turn with that one too. I was just wondering if they had enough motive to kill all these people in the family because we were running out of suspects. And then that kind of leads to the next question was, did you think there were enough clues pointing to Randy Cutter as the murderer who ended up abducting Becky and holding her captive for decades after killing the entire Doyle family except for Josie?
Yeah. I had I'm going to say I knew as soon as he showed up on the snowmobile in the present timeline, or that was my hunch as soon as he showed up, that he was one of the kidnappers. But I didn't know if it was just him or if he had acted with other people. And I was willing to read on to figure out why and how it all linked together. Cutter's wife saying he was getting the old farmyard fixed up was a big hint to me, and the dispute over farmland that escalated into murdered cattle. And they mentioned a chemical spill that was the police had investigated. And to me, that's like you can kind of see violence escalating there. That seemed like a yeah, good evidence. And then to the neighbors seeing a truck parked on the side of the road, and then the truck that tried to lure Josie away from her father. That made me think older male. I'm not entirely, I don't know why I have that feeling, but it seems like something that someone like an adolescent wouldn't have that reaction. You know, they wouldn't try and quietly lure a child away, maybe. Right? That's my read on it. But I did think that Brock Cutter was involved too for a while. Even though two kidnappers didn't totally make sense to me. Like, I don't know how could a father son kidnap a girl? I don't know. But so I did think he was involved until he passed away, like we talked about before. But yeah, did you think there was enough evidence pointing to Randy?
I wanted them to have first names. I wanted there to be a Brock Cutter and a Randy Cutter and people to be more clear about him because then he would have been a clearer suspect from the beginning. Because I did think it was a little bit of tricky pool. Aha, when we were talking about that creepy Cutter, we didn't mean Brock, we meant Randy. And it's just like, okay, fine. And so, but I mean, there is enough evidence there. We had to dig through it. But I do think it's generally for authors. I think you can't introduce the murderer in the second or third act. They have to be in the first act of the book because otherwise you're not playing fair with the readers. Aha, it wasn't me. It was my secret twin that nobody had knew I had. And I'm like, no, that's not fair.
Yeah.
I think that Brock Cutter was a witness and that he knew that his dad was the murderer, and that's why he was speeding away from the Doyle's house that night.
Okay.
And so
I
there
didn't
was
see
two
that.
different trucks. They had two different trucks because Deb Cutter had said both the trucks were missing. And so I don't know if Cutter was hanging out, stalking around because those girls were hanging out on the trampoline outside and Brock had a thing and it was just like so he may have been and then saw his dad do this and like what the hell? But then he doesn't tell Deputy Levi this. But I think he was fleeing something,
Yeah.
something that he knew his dad was involved and he didn't want a part of it. And I also think that Randy took the dog Roscoe. I think that, yeah, I think that he had taken Roscoe in an attempt to lure 12-year-old Josie away from the farm so he could snatch her. He made comments in the current timeline that his target was Josie and not Becky, and that Becky just happened to be there, and she wasn't able to escape into the corn. But what happened to Roscoe, man? Dog lovers want to know. Did Roscoe live down in the basement with Becky until he eventually died of old age, or did he kill the dog? Because I mean, he's already a three-time murderer and kidnapper, rapist. But if he's also killing dogs, then this
Too far. Too
right.
far.
My thoughts would have been, what if they had a live scene with William Doyle and Randy Cutter at the beginning talking about the disputed property, and and Josie's just overhearing it, I've told, that would have been more fair for me. Is to actually see that dispute just a little bit, and then let Randy glare over at Josie, and you just give you a shiver, and it's just like, okay, maybe that would have been too much. Maybe that would have been too much, but it would have been establishing more motive that he wanted to make off with Josie as punishment to the Doyle family, and move him into his new shed. I think I wish, yeah, I do wish we would have gotten some resolution as to Roscoe and if Randy had been responsible for that, because that was the initial story question: is where's Roscoe? Because that's what I was wondering the whole you know, chapter 4. Where's Roscoe? Who has Roscoe? Where is Roscoe? And then they never said. And then I wish we'd had resolution about what happened to Jackson Henley in the current timeline, because Wiley locked him up after he tried to help. And then we never hear from him again. He might be writing his own, I have been trapped in this farmhouse for, for the rest of
10
time.
years later.
No one let him out. Because I thought for sure when she was fighting with Randy that Jackson would have come out and helped.
Yes,
And right,
what I was expecting
because he's
too.
there, he's trapped there, but maybe not trapped that much. This man's been to prison, he might have some skills. So yeah, and then I was just like, maybe he's hanging out with Roscoe somewhere. We don't know. People just keep disappearing. Okay. Now, next question. The title has two meanings because it's the overnight guest. Becky is an overnight guest at the Doyle's house the night of the massacre, which resulted in her being kidnapped by Randy Cutter instead of Josie. But also Becky's daughter, Josie, young Josie, ends up being an overnight guest at Wily's house, who's grown up Josie. And so the cover blurb talks about the current timeline. And it talks about, oh, true crime writer Wiley Lark doesn't mind being snowed in. And then she finds a small child. And I'm just like, well, that's one overnight guest. But I think the real overnight guest was Becky. Because, right? It was a much more life-changing sleepover than getting offered some soup and a blanket from this lady and couch. So what are your thoughts on how the story is pitched versus what was the focus in the book itself and who was the overnight guest?
Well, I have to say first that you are very astute because I did not make that connection to the past overnight guest, who was Becky when they were 12. She was the overnight guest who got kidnapped, like you said. It's yeah, it makes the title so much more multi-layered and so good. So well done. Well done to you and well done to the author or the marketing team or whoever came up with that title because it's great. Yeah, I think it's interesting because the current storyline sort of it's sort of the focus because that's how they marketed the book and that's kind of when everything is solved. So I can see them marketing it as the current storyline. Uh, and I think that has to be the focus to tell this story. But yeah, the past the Y2K timeline shows the length of the captivity and the full horror of the crime of the past. And that one probably has the deeper effect on the reader after. So maybe it's marketed as the current timeline, but the past timeline is the one that's going to stick with you. Yeah, what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I thought so too. I thought that it applied to both timelines, but that the past really kind of dominated because Becky being an overnight guest at the Doyle's house changed everything for Becky. Josie's life absolutely changed too. But she didn't end up Randy's prisoner. She was raised by her grandparents. They took her out of that town. She built a life. She got married. She had a son. She's a successful author. She still carried a lot of scars and damage, but she wasn't locked up in the basement. Most split timeline stories spend more time grounded in the current and the past is revealed solely to give background and context. But I felt like in this one, the past kind of overpowered the present and it explained Wiley's funk in life and how she was still mired in the past until she could figure out what really happened and get that closure. Rescue Becky, help Becky and young Josie escape. And then she can move on and she can, feel free to love people and parent your son
Yeah.
and be more curious about the true crime that you're investigating. So all
Yes.
right. Last question. Do you have any advice or recommendations for authors who are writing mysteries with split timelines after and for split multiple POVs after reading The Overnight Guest?
Well, I know you'll have lots of great tips for this, but I would just say keep it simple. Decide carefully which POVs you need to tell your story and be aware of what you withhold and why in each POV. And make each decision with a focus on the needs of the plot and still respect the characters' fair and true reactions to situations. Yeah, to me I like the community aspect of of a book. I love when there's a big cast and a lot of different viewpoints. So that's my personal preference. But what would you advise authors taking this on?
No, that was great. A lot of the same. Make sure that all of the timelines and the POVs serve a story purpose. So like when you had said that Abby, was it Abby Miller? No, that's the Abby Morris is was showed up again when they were searching. It's just like, okay, I would have liked to have made that connection myself, but they were too far apart and I didn't have an electronic version. So I'm just like flipping around. Because it's just like, why did we start with her? What does she add to it? I would have loved to have seen her find something later.
Yeah,
And like, because there were clues, and there and we didn't need Deputy Levi and the sheriff to find all of them. We could have, she could have been one of the people who was like the lead for the white truck that ended up being not them at all, or something. And so it's like make sure that they all are serving a purpose and wrap up those loose ends, man. Roscoe and the guy who went to prison, what happened to Roscoe? Okay. But otherwise, I really liked it. And so if I'm picky, it's because I'm trying to like, pull it apart and stuff, but I really enjoyed it. And that's why I'm just like, ooh, I want to do a novel deep dive on this. And so for authors, if you want to have that pull and stuff too, you have to timeline this. When am I in Y2K? When am I putting these snippets at the room? Because the room POV disappeared once we knew that they'd been in the car crash. Then no, we don't see it anymore because we knew that that was happening leading up to the current timeline, and that was the culmination of that is we're breaking out of here. We're getting in this truck. My mom doesn't really know how to drive, and especially not in snow. Crash. And so that was it, and we didn't need it anymore. And so we didn't need to continue to have more scenes of what it had been like for young Josie to grow up in that, because we got the picture and you're out, you're in the snow, and you've been under orders to not tell anybody anything, and you're not even to admit that you're not a boy and that you're really a girl,
right.
and all those things. And so yeah, and so when do we go back and forth? What details from the past do we need to know to drive this current timeline forward? And then when to reveal the connections between the two. And so I suspected that the Wily was Josie, but I'm a suspicious reader by nature. And so I'd be curious to hear how many people in your book group had put that together too pretty early on and stuff. But all of those things make it so that people your best your best, it's hard to explain how to do this, but if you can write a book that people want to talk about, then they're going to tell people about it and they're going to encourage other people to read it because they want to talk about it with them. And so, so yeah, make sure all the timelines and the POVs serve a purpose, and to make connections and crossovers between them, and then wrap up those loose ends and you're good. All right, do you have any
Yeah.
other thoughts, Kelly, you want to add for this?
No, I'm grateful that we could talk about this book. It was really fun to go through and kind of do a deep dive into it. And I think it's good for writers and readers to kind of, go a little deeper and see exactly how authors pull things off. So this is fun.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much for joining me. And viewers, if you are interested in getting the book club booster kit, which is the list of questions that Kelly and I answered, I'll have a link down underneath in the description of the video. You can click on that and download it. And if you join my newsletter, you will get all of them because I'm constantly talking about my videos in my newsletter. And be sure to join us next week when we'll have another video about writing, editing, and the writing life. So thank you very much. Be sure to like and subscribe. This is freelance fiction editor Miranda Darrow wishing you happy writing.